There's a curious divide between Europe and America when it comes to motorsports. In Europe, we really love rally driving. Rally driving is extremely fast, intense driving through hazardous, narrow routes, often driving through mud or snow. It's so extreme, in fact, that a navigator is a necessary component, someone to warn the driver of upcoming twists and turns and hazards. And even with a navigator, there are still plenty of crashes. But it's not popular in America, presumably because the competitive element isn't quite so apparent as it's largely a time-based event. And we all know how competitive the Americans are. So Codemasters has never had much luck selling one of its flagship properties, the Colin McRae Rally series, in America. It always does well in Europe, well enough that they made about 5 of them, but it's always been a pretty niche title in the States. Dirt 2 tries to appeal to both audiences by keeping the off-road motif, but moving away from rallying into more competitive driving modes. It has all the mud and gravel and hairpin turns that Europeans love, while also having all the competition that Americans love. And it's fair to say that Dirt 2 has been quite successful in merging the two distinct styles of racing into a game that has appeal on both sides of the Atlantic. But it's not without a casualty. That casualty is the dignity of the motorsport. Where previous games in the Colin McRae Rally series, and even the original Dirt, harboured a respect for the profession, Dirt 2 feels like a fucking Tony Hawk game merged with a fucking Guitar Hero game. It has a very obnoxious, very Americanized, very inappropriate style. It's very loud and just very obnoxious. It's depressing to see yet another European property Americanized simply because the Americans don't like stuff that isn't American, while Europeans are expected to grit their teeth and tolerate this.
Hey cheesemonger, this is Utah. It's gonna be amazing.
This place is awesome. The people here know how to party. The people here know how to party.
And this is from an English company. But if you can stand being told how awesome and amazing everything is going to be every 5 seconds, Dirt 2 is a pretty solid racing game. The main mode is the Dirt Tour. Much like in Grid, you'll find that you start as a nobody at the bottom of the pile and you have to work your way up, unlocking new vehicles and access to new events as you become more famous. Grid tracked your progress using a very intuitive reputation system, which felt natural and made sense and worked fine. Dirt 2, for some reason, uses experience points and levels like a role-playing game. I'm not sure why exactly, except that levelling up occurs frequently, which keeps Johnny OCD playing or something. It's pretty stupid, quite annoying. There are 9 locations on the world map, and I actually find it to be quite an interesting world map, as Malaysia is hovering over East Africa, China is hovering over Malaysia, and Japan is hovering over China. I'm led to assume that the retard who wrote the game's dialogue...
Hey cheesemonger, this is China. It's a whole new world.
also designed the world map. To begin with, only a couple of locations were available, and only a couple of events at each location. There are quite a few events, the indirect competition events like rallying, of course, being against the clock on very hazardous courses. Trailblazer seems to be sort of halfway between rallying and drag racing, taking place on long, very open, very fast courses, with some twists mixed in here and there. Gatecrasher is a timed event where you have to hit objects on the route to restore your dwindling limited time. Then there are the direct competition events like Rallycross, Last Man Standing and Raid, which are pretty much your usual driving around a circuit trying to come first while 7 other drivers are doing the exact same thing. For people moving over to Dirt 2 from Grid, one of the more disappointing omissions is the cool team mechanic. In Grid, you would create your team, design your car's appearance, assign sponsors, and hire and fire co-drivers to race alongside. All of this is gone in Dirt 2. It's been replaced by a buddy system. The game features a number of rival drivers that are prominent personalities in the game. Naturally, all but one are American. These people get to know you as they race with you and eventually become your buddies. You can also pick from a few liveries for your car design, but these are preset. The cars are still plastered with sponsors, but you have no control over them anymore, and rather than earning you money, they're purely cosmetic. It's a pity to see the whole team thing go. It was a really cool idea, and it was a satisfying and effective way to portray progression through the game that also had some real bearing on gameplay as well. Another cool thing that's gone is the objectives. In Grid you'd be given objectives by your sponsors like finish no less than third or take no damage in the race or whatever to receive cash bonuses. This has gone, and in its place are missions. Missions are very much like and just as trivial as achievements, except that they're earned cumulatively. So for instance, there's a mission called Environmentalist that has you smashing a set number of environmental objects in the game. After hitting that number, you complete the mission and earn experience. You earn experience for all sorts of things, like spinning out, using the flashback thing to rewind time if you crash, and just for actually playing the game for so many minutes. All of these missions are ranked at least 5 times, so you'll be earning these things repeatedly. It's weird they've taken a workable mechanic that had tangible rewards for actual accomplishments, which also played off the well-implemented sponsorship thing, and they've replaced it with rewards simply for playing the game. Not even for performing well, or in fact often for the opposite. They reward failure, which in itself is stupid, and it comes at the expense of a very workable and very well-implemented mechanic. All of those missions you complete in single player are also completed again separately in multiplayer, and in multiplayer they do actually at least make a little sense. The actual races themselves are pretty solid. Most of the stuff that made Grid such a fun game has been carried over, so there's solid, responsive handling, a good sense of speed, and the crashes have a real punch to them. The indirect competition events all work pretty well, but I find the direct competition events pretty annoying, as it's very easy to spin out in off-road racing, but mix that with the shoulder-to-shoulder jostling of the other cars, and keeping yourself from spinning out constantly becomes an ordeal. Whether this makes the game thrilling or tedious is really down to you, but I found it tedious, and stuck largely to the indirect competitions, which are my preference anyway. You can literally exclusively play only the events you want to play. If you only want to do rallying, you can do that. But that will force you to repeat events in order to level up and unlock new stuff, and with the diminishing returns for repeating events, it's pretty arduous. But it is nice to be able to tailor your own experience. It does, however, illustrate a real problem with the game. There are way too few tracks per event. In a 5-track event, you're gonna be doing at least one mirror, and it very quickly gets old, particularly if you like to stick to a few specific race types. I think we're all used to mirrors and multiple routes through the same basic tracks being passed off as separate tracks these days, but even so, there are way too few tracks per event. That's not to say there aren't many tracks overall, they're just spread over 7 or 8 different race types. So if you only want to do 2 or 3 different race types, you may only have 4 or 5 or 6 tracks available to you. Although the crashes are just as spectacular, the damage system has been simplified. In Grid, you had separate damage indicators for each wheel. There was engine damage, transmission damage, axle damage, and probably a few others I don't remember, because I don't know anything about cars. In Dirt 2, it's just engine and wheels, but all 4 wheels collectively. It's weird because Grid was already a simple game, and Dirt 2 is even simpler. Going back to the original Colin McRae Rally games, in those games your cars would take all kinds of damage, and then you'd have a limited amount of time between races to make modifications to your setup or to make repairs, making taking damage a huge thing, and the repair choices you make between races vital. It's just such a shame to see that Grid is so much simpler than Colin McRae Rally, and Dirt 2 is so much simpler than Grid. The weirdest thing is that most of the emissions in Dirt 2 aren't even complexities, they're just content. The game is not simpler overall, really. There's just so much less of it. The replays, at least, are as gorgeous as ever, and you can easily spend about as long watching your replays as actually playing the game, as each one is just supremely watchable. There's a pretty comprehensive set of tools for playing online, and getting into games or setting up your own with loads of customization options is really simple. There are even passive online competitions for things like getting the longest drifts or the fastest lap times in which everyone competes. But as with all other racing games, when you play online, people are going to use you as a barrier on corners and send you spinning out. And like I said earlier, in an off-road game that becomes an especial problem, so I pretty much gave up on that after one game. And with the indirect competition events, since these all essentially revolve around arbitrary objectives, I didn't see much need to have other people set those objectives for me when I can easily just race against myself, which is what I'm basically doing anyway. So multiplayer in Dirt 2 feels pretty much completely redundant to me. If you want an off-road racing game and you can tolerate all the simplification, the Arcadification, and the Americanization, then Dirt 2 is probably a game you're gonna be able to enjoy. But all this game has done for me is made me want to bust out my PS1 and play some Colin McRae Rally. The real tragedy is that all the Arcadification and Americanization has clearly paid off, as Cody has quite quickly announced Dirt 3, which probably signals the end of good off-road racing once and for all.
The people here know how to party.